RAF Short Sunderland aircraft thunders over the foggy Scottish Highlands. On board is Prince George, the Duke of Kent, the brother of King George VI. Suddenly, without warning, the plane loses height and slams into the side of a hill known locally as Eagle's Rock. The crash kills everyone on board except for the rear gunner, who's somehow thrown clear of the burning wreck. He's left to wander the misty hillside, dazed, lost, and alone. It seems like a tragic accident, but is there something more to the crash than meets the eye?
There are theories, inevitably, that there were dirty deeds afoot in disposing of him.
For 70 years, the crash that killed the Duke of Kent has been surrounded by mystery. Conspiracy theorists have suggested that he was in fact assassinated. But why? Who could have wanted him dead? And can the riddle ever be solved?
It does make you wonder whether his recollections are what's been suggested to him or what he actually remembers.
Allegations of a cover-up remain. Why is it that the official records have never been found? And was the sole survivor silenced by the authorities?
When he came back, he never spoke again.
Can World War II air crash detective Garth Barnard sift through the evidence to discover why a member of the royal family perished on a barren Scottish hillside all those years ago?
You cannot get hold of this, so I'm quite taken aback that it's in front of me now.
For 2 decades, Garth Barnard has been investigating World War II RAF air training crashes. But today, a different kind of mystery has grabbed his attention.
I don't normally get involved with the conspiracy theories and espionage, but the Short Sunderland crash that killed the Duke of Kent, there's so much controversy surrounding it that it deserves a closer look.
As the Duke of Kent made himself comfortable inside the Short Sunderland seaplane, the Australian pilots, Pilot Officer Sidney Smith and Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, prepared for takeoff.
Frank Goyen was reputed to be an excellent pilot and had a very good record during his service. And I think that's probably why he was chosen.
Just after 1 p.m, the aircraft, with 15 men on board, slowly climbed into the cloudy sky. It was going to fly the Duke to begin a morale-boosting tour of the RAF base at Reykjavik in Iceland. The planned route would take the Sunderland from RAF Alnays at Invergordon, up the east coast of Scotland to the Butt of Lewis, where it would fix its position, leave the Scottish coast and head across the North Sea to Iceland.
The Sunderland was flying up the east coast of Scotland when it would appear that the pilot decided to take a shortcut by literally cutting off the corner. Unfortunately, the weather conditions were deteriorating to such an extent that the cloud was literally covering all of the hills and the mountainsides, so they became invisible.
Goyen and his crew had been prepared for broken cloud, but suddenly the plane was engulfed by a thick soup of fog and mist. Even in the gloom, people on the ground could tell that the Sunderland was flying perilously close to the hills of Caithness. And then, tragedy. Goyen's Sunderland smashed into Eagle's Rock, a hill less than 3 miles from the coast. The plane, still completely full with fuel for the long trip, burst into flames on impact, creating a scene of utter devastation.
It ploughed in by the nose and the aircraft pushed in front of it a huge volume of peat and heather until it could push it no further. It then flipped over, broke, and the fuel exploded and a huge fire started, giving the occupants of the aircraft no chance.
The King's brother lay dead, but the mystery of Eagle's Rock had only just begun.
So was it a tragic accident or was it something more? Was it the status of the Duke of Kent that sort of people thought he couldn't perish in such an accident? Or was there a plot to kill him? Was he really visiting Iceland, or was it a cover story for a secret mission or something? I really need to find out the truth.
Garth begins by finding out more about the Duke himself. Why on earth would anybody want to kill him? Prince George, Duke of Kent, was just 39 at the time of the crash. In his role as Air Commodore in the welfare section of RAF Inspector General's staff, the Duke routinely made visits to RAF stations to meet with servicemen and women. He was himself a qualified pilot. The Duke of Kent was certainly a glamorous character, and he was immensely popular with the general public, but rumours were swirling that the Duke's private life was not quite all it seemed.
The Duke of Kent was in fact the brother of King Edward VIII, who clearly abdicated. He was also the brother of King George VI. And in the run-up period to the Second World War, he did get involved in a few sort of escapades that raised eyebrows officially, and I'm sure at Buckingham Palace as well. His sexual orientation was open to some question at the time, and he got involved in a few scrapes along the way and affairs with quite notable people of the period, apparently, allegedly with Noel Coward and also with Barbara Cartland. So there were some fairly big names involved with him. So he kind of scandalised high society to an extent in the run-up period to the Second World War.
A decadent past was one thing, but it was the Duke's alleged political leanings that some feel marked him out as a target for the British authorities.
Like his brother, Edward VIII, who visited Hitler in Germany pre-war, there were very strong suggestions, and possibly more than that the Duke of Kent had similar leanings, and therefore, things like that were clearly very uncomfortable with the British establishment, particularly at this time in the war. There was this supposed Nazi link, and therefore, we need to get rid of this chap because actually, he's a bit of a problem.
So was the Duke pro-Nazi, or as some have suggested, trying to broker a peaceful end to a war which was not going well for the British at the time? Whatever the truth, the Duke's life seemed full of complexities. Garth is beginning to see why the crash has attracted so many conspiracy theories. A search through his usually reliable sources and thorough archives has drawn a blank. For such a famous case, there's precious little official evidence.
I just can't seem to find any official information on the crash. And without that information, it's easy to see why there are conspiracy theories and how they come about with just such little information available, especially with something as sensitive as the Duke of Kent being on board. Maybe the official records are lost. Maybe they've been lost on purpose or embargoed. Who knows? But are the authorities trying to hide something here? Maybe there's some kind of cover-up.
Could there really have been a plot to kill the Duke? It seems fanciful, but it was no secret that he, like many other members of the British establishment, had had regular contact with notable German figures before the outbreak of war. His elder brother Edward, who had abdicated the throne in 1936, had even been an advocate of a peace treaty with Hitler. Edward had been dispatched to the Bahamas to keep him out of trouble. But was it felt that the Duke of Kent might present the authorities with a similar political problem? To try and find out more, Garth journeys up to Scotland. Why exactly was Prince George going to Iceland?
The role of the RAF in Iceland during World War II was partly as a staging post between North America and the UK, but it was partly, more importantly perhaps, as a base for maritime patrol. It was somewhere from where they could keep an eye on the North Atlantic and to some extent the North Sea.
Like all members of the royal family during the war, the Duke's movements were a closely guarded secret. Those entrusted with his safety were men whose war was fought well away from the gaze of the public, in the skies over the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Flying their short Sunderlands and Catalina flying boats, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the German U-boats that were a constant menace to the vital convoys supplying Britain. They were called Coastal Command.
It was obviously dangerous from the point of view that they had to fly in all weather. Regardless what the weather conditions were, they had a job to do, which was to protect the convoys and also to do anti-submarine patrols. So they had no option. It wasn't a matter of just fair weather flying. But it was, it was away on the coast. People didn't know an awful lot about it. And of course, where the bases were very heavily restricted. You couldn't come in and out as you liked. And the result of that was that people didn't hear very much about Coastal Command, but they did a very essential job making sure that the convoys got where they were going as safely as possible.
One of the bases controlled by Coastal Command was RAF Oban on the west coast of Scotland. To get there, Garth crosses Oban Harbour to the Isle of Kerrera. It was here that short Sunderland WWII, flown by Frank Goyen and his crew, was based. As one of the most experienced pilots in Coastal Command, it was the Australians' job to get Prince George safely to Iceland.
He would pick the crew that he felt supported him as best as possible. So his members in the aircraft would be probably his best choice to fly with him to do all the ancillary duties that were required. But he had a very good reputation as a pilot, so that was probably why he was chosen to do that particular flight.
Also flying that day was Goyen's boss at 228 Squadron, Wing Commander Thomas Moseley. Moseley was another expert pilot and navigator, and as commander of the squadron, he felt that he should be on the flight to accompany their VIP guest. So a crack team had been assembled for the Duke's flight, which was to be made in one of the RAF's most reliable aircraft. It was the workhorse of Coastal Command, the Short Sunderland flying boat.
The Short Sunderland flying boat was really the right aircraft at the right time for RAF Coastal Command. It was a brilliant design. It was a 4-engined, high-wing, stressed skin flying boat. And it's kind of what it says on the tin, a flying boat. The fuselage has a boat hull, which means the aircraft doesn't need to depend on airfields with conventional runways. It can land and take off from water. So it could operate even from quite rough seas. Bear in mind, though, that the Sunderland was a big aeroplane, so it didn't have a fighter-style climb rate. You could open the throttles and ask it to climb. It would take a while to get there, and for that reason, it was pretty undesirable to fly over mountainous regions.
Garth leaves Kerrera to trace the story of the Sunderland's last few days. On Sunday, 23rd of August, Goyen's Sunderland leaves Oban to fly up the Caledonian Canal towards Invergordon, where they were to meet the Duke and fly on to Iceland. As Garth walks along the shore from where the Duke took off on the 25th of August 1942, he considers one fascinating theory. Was the Duke really going to Iceland, or was it somewhere else? The normal route would have taken the Prince along the Scottish seacoast, keeping over water. So how and why did he end up inland? One controversial theory is that the Duke was going to meet Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess.
One of the theories that's been advanced for the death of the Duke of Kent is that, in fact, he was on this so-called special mission. And the truth of that special mission was that, in fact, he was taking Rudolf Hess somewhere. And Rudolf Hess had arrived in 1941 under bizarre circumstances. He'd bailed out of a Messerschmitt 110 over Scotland, wanting to come and apparently make peace overtures to the British. And there's certainly a great deal of mystery and debate and confusion, if you like, about the real story behind Rudolf Hess. And one of the stranger elements of the suggestions that have been made is that, in fact, Rudolf Hess had been smuggled up to Scotland after his arrival there in 1941 and was actually being picked up by the Duke of Kent and flown somewhere on the Sunderland for some purpose that nobody has really come up with an answer for.
So what of the Hess connection? The Duke was in the vicinity of Hess's famous landing in Scotland the year before, and one theory has it that he was there to meet Hess as part of a British peace party. Hess's capture denied the chance of that meeting ever taking place. But could the Duke have been using the cover of a trip to Iceland to finally rendezvous with Hess? The authors of a recent book allege that the Duke was to pick up Hess from Lochmore, which is approximately 10 miles from the crash site, and then fly to neutral Sweden to conduct peace negotiations with the German delegation there. It's an intriguing theory, which could explain the plane's incursion inland. To add to the mystery, the Duke was allegedly carrying a leather briefcase which was handcuffed to his wrist. What could have been inside the case?
Clearly there was some sensitivity to the loss of the Duke of Kent on lots of levels. And I suppose that with someone that high profile and with, if you like, albeit that he was royal with a slightly murky past, there are theories inevitably that there were dirty deeds afoot in disposing of him. And in fact, there are certain bits of information that are not yet in the public domain. And I suppose all of this feeds into, if you like, the conspiracy theorists who want to suggest or like to suggest that he was effectively murdered by the British establishment to get him out of the way.
Around lunchtime on Tuesday, 25th of August, 1942, the Duke and his entourage walked down to the jetty to board the Sunderland. The plane slipped its moorings at 12:50. 20 minutes later, it climbed into the sky. Around 30 minutes after that, the Duke of Kent was dead. For Garth, there's plenty of speculation, but a frustrating lack of official documents. The British archives have not given him any information. But what about those of another country? With Australian crew members on board, could Australian war records be any more helpful?
Well, I've just accessed, or in the process of accessing the National Archives of Australia to see if I can find anything there on Goyen. I'm searching for Goyen and there's nothing here, not that's available to look at.
With no luck in finding out any more about Goyen, Garth turns his attention to the second pilot, Sidney Smith.
Well, it looks like I've found all the official data. There's 87 pages, so there's quite a bit to go through. It's fascinating stuff. Details on him, a bit of personal background, lots of rubber stamps, as you'd expect. And we have the Court of Inquiry investigation, which I didn't think was available. There's been obviously lots of talk that this you cannot get hold of this. So I'm quite taken aback that it's in front of me now. This is the key to who was doing what, who was on board, who was flying, who was at the controls at the time of the aircraft, or hopefully who was at the time of the controls, and make all the confirmations of who's who and where they were and what they were doing. This is key.
At last, Garth has the elusive document in his hands. Can it answer a fundamental question? Who exactly was at the controls that day? Because a startling fact comes to light. It is Wing Commander Moseley who is listed as first pilot. According to the document, Sidney Smith was not at the controls that day.
I'm just looking at this report now to try and ascertain who was at the controls when it crashed. Initially, it says that the pilot was Goyen. It states that quite clearly. But Goyen is also listed as the captain. There's also the first pilot, which is Moseley, and second pilot, Smith. But on the next page, it says here that first pilot Moseley is listed at the top, not second, where I'd expect Goyen to be at the top. But actually, Moseley is at the top, which may suggest he was at the controls.
The report contains many witness statements from people connected with the flight, including meteorologists and maintenance staff, but also the surviving rear gunner, Andrew Jack.
Reading through this further, I'm looking at witness statements now. Just got Andy Jacks in front of me. He's being asked questions at who was at the controls of the aircraft. Why would they be asking that? I'm not so sure at this point. But I also find his answers that he's giving to be very yes, no, rather than not sure, because obviously what he went through with the crash.
Even though Jack's evidence lacks detail, Garth believes that it raises some doubt as to who was actually present in the cockpit. Why else would it have asked who was in the second pilot's seat? Was it Moseley, Smith, or even the Duke himself. With no evidence of any mechanical problems, the Court of Inquiry report lays the blame squarely at the door of Captain Goyen. It concludes that he changed his flight plan for reasons unknown, and that this sudden lack of judgment was quite unpredictable. As far as they were concerned, case closed. Except that Garth has uncovered another surprising detail.
I'm looking now at the Court of Inquiry, or the summary of the Court of Inquiry, and I've got the commanding officer saying that it's a non-operational flight and it should not have been carried out. And I've got another comment below that from the group commander saying he concurs with the findings. However, it should have presented no difficulty to the crew of such experience. Now, I've seen a lot of these, and and I have never seen that where a group commander who would concur 1 minute would sort of stay that over the top of the commanding officer. I find that very, very strange. Very strange.
The Scottish weather is notorious, especially over high terrain. So could the weather have played a part?
When the Sunderland crashed into the mountainside, the visibility was very poor. Effectively, the aircraft was flying in cloud with nil visibility, and the pilot just didn't see the mountainside. Now, aircraft flying into mountains and high ground in the United Kingdom or anywhere, come to that matter, during the Second World War were a very, very common occurrence. It happened all the time, and what you have to bear in mind is that the navigation on these aircraft at that time was pretty basic. There were no electronic aids. It was all down to, if you like, the Mark I eyeball, maps and dead reckoning and that kind of navigation. And they were very susceptible to weather conditions, and when the weather could change very, very quickly in any case, particularly in those sort of mountainous regions in Scotland. So it was not an unusual event. There were many, many aircraft that flew into mountains in very, very similar circumstances. I suppose the only unusual factor in this particular crash was the high profile of one of the passengers on board.
Officially then, the crash was caused by pilot error and poor weather. However, Garth believes that the Court of Inquiry report still doesn't offer a full explanation for the crash. He thinks the difference of opinion on the weather conditions by two senior officials is symptomatic of the court's findings. It presents an outwardly straightforward case, but beyond the official language, a more confused picture emerges. The questions still remain. Was it Goyen who was at the controls that afternoon? And if so, how did a vastly experienced pilot come to make such a terrible error of judgment? If it was Goyen flying the plane, was he following orders to take the Duke's party to a secret rendezvous inland? Was the pilot actually Wing Commander Moseley? Or could the Duke himself have been flying the aircraft? Garth has now travelled up the east coast to try and reach the remote crash site, and has enlisted the help of local rambler Jeff Leet. After a punishing few hours walking the hills, Garth can see how steeply the land rises from the sea. What was a seaplane doing so low over such hilly ground? In the shadow of the Eagles Rock crash site, Jeff tells Garth more about the plane's last moments.
The area behind is Eagles Rock, and you can see the monument, which more or less marks the spot where the Sunderland splattered itself on the hilltop. And there's absolutely nothing left of the plane now, not surprisingly. It was a long time ago. It would have flown in more or less above us where we're standing.
So it went directly above us?
Pretty well, yes.
What sort of visibility, sort of distance-wise, was it at that time?
Very poor, I would think. I would think they'd no idea they were over the hills, or they would have been somewhere else.
So with the height where the actual aircraft crashed into Eagles Rock, how much, I mean, the topography of the land, how did the land lie? Could they have missed it? I mean...
It's about 800 feet high, and if they'd been going 50 foot higher, they'd have missed it. But there's another 900 foot high one hump just a little beyond, so they were in bad trouble.
They were in bad trouble.
Yeah. I'm told there's a groove.
There's a groove in the ground?
Groove left in the ground.
Okay, should we go and have a look?
Let's see if we can find the groove.
Garth imagines the plight of the survivor of the crash, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack. Jack was in the rear turret of the plane, and he was thrown clear as the burning Sunderland flipped over. Jack was believed killed until he emerged from the foggy hillside a full 24 hours after the plane came down. Garth and Jeff eventually reached the crash site.
We've made our way to the monument. We've got here now. So whereabouts was the actual impact point?
Well, the impact point appears to be sort of diagonally back there. There's a big depression, and the scatter of all the bits and pieces of the plane spread up here. And,
in this direction here?
In that direction. And presumably the tail gunner, Jack, was sort of thrown clear in that general direction. And that's where I gather the Duke's body was found, and that's where there's now a little monument recording this sad spot.
With the debris in this direction, is there any debris left over there to see?
Well, very little to see. You've got it's now being cleared a little as the rain has washed away some of the vegetation. So some tiny bits, tiny fragments are appearing.
Many RAF crews operated an unofficial sideline in the export of certain desirable but hard-to-get goods.
For RAF personnel based in Iceland during the war, even though it's a beautiful country, they probably wouldn't have appreciated that very much, and they would have felt they were at the back end of empire. So any creature comforts, little luxuries like perhaps a bottle of illicit whiskey or some extra cigarettes or something like that would have been very much appreciated to alleviate the considerable tedium of serving up there. And of course, it was the pilots that just quietly would tend to bring this stuff in for them.
The visit to the crash site has helped Garth to dismiss the so-called Hess theory. The alleged Lockmore pickup point is to the northwest of Eagles Rock. The plane came down on the southeastern face of the hill. If it had landed there and was returning to its original route to either Iceland or Sweden, then surely the plane would have hit from the north or west. For that reason, many believe that the Hess theory just doesn't add up.
In my view, it's complete nonsense that Rudolf Hess was on that aircraft and he'd been picked up by the Duke of Kent. If that was the case and Rudolf Hess was killed on board that particular Sunderland, then who on earth was the Rudolf Hess that was in prison and later went to the Nuremberg war trials and spent the rest of his life in prison? And again, there are lots of conspiracy theorists who say, well, actually, it wasn't really Rudolf Hess, it was somebody else. So there's lots of conspiracy theories that kind of feed into this one of the Duke of Kent.
Although there seems little hard evidence to back up the more colourful theories about the crash, the fact remains that the Sunderland was way off course. There must have been a more conventional reason for the accident. 5 miles away from the crash site in the coastal town of Dunbeath, Garth meets George Bethune. George's father was a local policeman who, together with colleague James Sutherland, rushed up to the crash site on the day.
They cycled up to what we call the gravel pit, and they could smell. The fog was thick, but my father said you could smell it. It was in an awful state, it was still burning, and they had to look at all the bodies and everything else. So, of course, both being soldiers from the First World War, they knew that the person would have identified disc on his left wrist. And they looked, and my father said, even to his dying day, I've never forgotten what was on the disc. HRS Duke of Kent, the Cuppins, Bucks, England. So they knew who it was.
George's father found the Duke with the mysterious briefcase still handcuffed to his wrist.
The briefcase had burst open, and my father said that kroner notes, 100 kroner notes, was flying around the site. He never actually said that they came out of the briefcase. He inferred that they'd come out of the briefcase. But I'm absolutely certain that it was not because of the kroner notes that the Duke would have had the briefcase. His equerry would have carried the notes. So there must have been something in the briefcase that he was carrying that he didn't want to leave his person.
The discovery of Swedish krona at the crash site lends some weight to the theory that the Duke may have been heading to Sweden, not Iceland. Or was there another explanation for the money being on the flight?
There could be a perfectly rational explanation to that, because although Swedish krona were of no use in Iceland at that time, neutral Sweden was doing business at that time with Britain, with the United Kingdom. I don't know. I mean, it's just a theory, but maybe the Duke of Kent was to make a money drop on behalf of the British government to a Swedish representative in Iceland. So there could be lots of reasons for that.
George also has more intriguing information about the survivor, Andrew Jack. It came direct from Jack's own mother.
The first few days, he was quite open about what had happened. But on the Saturday morning, people arrived from the south, and she said she never forgot the bed had wheels, and they took the bed, wheeled it along, burst open the door with it away to a quiet corner. And when he came back, he never spoke again about the crash site. His brother, who was a sergeant in the Scots Guards at the time, he visited on the Saturday with his mother and his sister. He said that Jack said, "I can't say anything about the crash. I have now signed the Official Secrets Act." And his brother looked at him and said, "With hands like that, how could you sign it?" "Oh," he said, they held my hand."
Andrew Jack himself never officially spoke about the crash, except to agree with the official version of events. Once he'd recovered from his injuries, he was posted to Gibraltar, but several visits made to him by the Duke's wife, Princess Marina, only added to the suspicion that he knew more about the crash than he told the Court of Inquiry. One thing Jack certainly never confirmed was the belief that the Duke himself was flying the plane. Despite all this, George has a more mundane answer as to why the Sunderland turned inland.
Our records that we discovered a few years ago of the people that sat down on the headland there, spotting and recording everything that happened in the air and the sea, showed that many of the aircraft didn't follow the official route, but cut in over the lowlands of Caithness. And of course, Admiral Sinclair, who owned Dunbeath Estate at that time, living in the castle, he always said, "Oh my, they just turned in too soon." In other words, where they turned in was perhaps 2 miles too soon.
Some believe that the Sunderland was simply blown off course. For such a thing to happen would have been unusual, and the strength of the wind that day was not enough to blow the plane 13 to 15 degrees off course. But those with local knowledge say that it's not impossible.
Some people have looked at this in great detail from the records of the strength of the wind at Wick. I have spoken to a couple of old fishermen who know the Burnie Firth like the back of their hand, and they've pointed out the strength of the wind at Wick is not necessarily the strength of the wind up here or near Alness. It could have been far gustier. So yes, they could have been.
As he leaves Scotland, Garth considers an investigation which is full of inconsistencies. On the one hand, the conspiracy theories and rumours can mostly be disproved or explained, but on the other, there are still mysteries. Why was the Duke carrying a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, for example? If he was carrying out some sort of secret negotiations with the Germans, was it with the blessing of the British government? Or did it dramatically silence him? Again, it seems fanciful, but with allegations of an assassination attempt by British intelligence services on French leader Charles de Gaulle later emerging, perhaps it's not so easily dismissed, particularly as the de Gaulle allegations involve the sabotage of his plane.
When you get an accident of the kind that befell the Duke of Kent, and that then breeds conspiracy theories, those theories are generally based upon exceptional claims. And in order to substantiate those, you need exceptional evidence. But whenever a high-profile person dies, it doesn't matter whether it's John F. Kennedy or Michael Jackson. If there are slightly odd or unusual circumstances surrounding their death, then the conspiracy theories inevitably will be born.
So was it accident or assassination? Garth has sent the Eagle Rock evidence to air safety expert Gary Wan to see if he can come up with an explanation for what happened. He begins by addressing the conspiracy theories.
As far as conspiracy theories go, it's always easy to come up with a story, particularly if something's happened with a VIP or with an aircraft and the accident isn't investigated probably as much as it might be. But I think really it's unlikely that there's any conspiracy involved. It's just too random an event really for that to be the case.
Gary also feels that the Court of Inquiry into Anti-Jack's evidence leaves something to be desired.
The Court of Inquiry findings and the accident report are quite thin. There isn't a lot of detail, and certainly I would have expected them to look into a lot more detail. And certainly if it was being done today, there'd be far more investigation with regards to the wreckage, where it was, how it had hit the ground, whether or not the engines were performing as they should be. And I think, again, they would have looked into who was on the flight deck and who was flying the airplane. It's something they didn't really touch on at all. The evidence from the survivor to the Court of Inquiry was key in deciding what caused the accident, or at least letting the Court of Inquiry judge what caused the accident. It's quite interesting, the survivor seems to have clear recollections of some part of the accident, the aircraft descending, people talking on the intercom. But it's not unusual in these cases for the survivor to have no recollection whatsoever, and it does make you wonder whether his recollections are what's been suggested to him or what he actually remembers, bearing in mind he did have large blanks about the accident itself. They wanted to sort out what the cause was quite quickly. The evidence coming from him was key, and it may have been a case that they suggested to him what might have happened, and that was what he came up with and what went into the report.
The Sunderland had an experienced crew and even a primitive form of radar for detecting coastlines and submarines. So how does Gary explain the navigational error that saw them fly into Eagles Rock?
Even though the weather wasn't particularly good, the flight was a routine flight, so there was a possibility that the navigation was being done in a quite straightforward fashion. They departed on a known heading, they allowed for the wind, they probably descended below the cloud over the sea, so it was just a case of turning inland at a point they wanted to shorten the route, and maybe even had the coast in sight. But it doesn't necessarily mean the radar was switched on, the navigators were sitting watching the maps. Because it was such a routine flight, that may have led them into a degree of complacency, which could lead to a mistake being made. It's happened in the past where a pilot conducting a flight they've done many times before, in an aircraft they've flown many times before, has made a very simple but costly mistake.
From the evidence, what does Gary think happened to the short Sunderland?
I believe the accident may have been caused when the pilot descended over the sea quite safely and then turned to cut the corner, fly over land over the north of Scotland, and was just caught out by the weather conditions and the low cloud. As the aircraft was routing to the northeast, depending on the weather conditions at the time, the pilot may have elected either to try and climb above the cloud or descend down below it. If he was going to descend below it, the safest thing to do would be descend over the sea. If there'd been an onshore wind, then the aircraft may have been more to the west than they thought. So when they descended and turned to the northwest, there's a chance they weren't quite where they thought they were, and they may have been surprised by the high ground as they descended through the cloud. The fact that there was one survivor from the aircraft, who was the tail gunner, suggests that when the aircraft hit the hill, it was a fairly glancing blow. So there's a very good chance that the pilot did come out the bottom of the cloud or saw the rising ground as flying towards it and tried to pull the aircraft up above the hill. Didn't quite make it, and the aircraft hit the hill at a fairly shallow angle. Wasn't an unusual occurrence. It happened then, and it still happens today. It's known as controlled flight into terrain.
Could there have been another factor that contributed to the controlled flight into terrain? With Goyen's superior as first pilot, and even the allegation that the Duke himself could have been flying, a modern military term called cross-cockpit gradient may have played a part in the tragedy. Former RAF and commercial test pilot Chris Roberts explains more.
If you're in a military environment, you've got a VIP on board, and he has an aviation experience, then it was quite normal, and indeed still is quite normal, for them to be allowed to do a little bit of the flying. And the problem then comes for the other pilot immediately engaged in one of the two seats, the tact and the diplomacy and the perceived ability he's got to intervene as readily and as quickly as he may need. There was another accident which is much more recent, where a Vulcan coming back from an overseas trip into Heathrow, which was being flown by an air marshal, ended up crashing, and the person who was blamed, quite rightly, was not the air marshal but the other pilot at the front of the Vulcan who should have prevented the accident. One of the aspects could well have been that adverse gradient, whereas a lowly person, you don't want to jump in on a much more important person and intervene as soon as you should.
Back at home, Garth has reached his own conclusions about what actually happened to the Duke of Kent's aircraft. Garth believes that the weather was mostly to blame.
The weather in Vergorden was good for takeoff, but the visibility deteriorated badly as they reached the area of Dunbeath.
Garth thinks that the Sunderland crew intended to shorten their journey by cutting across the lowlands of Caithness, but that a southeasterly wind blew the aircraft off course.
As crews regularly did this, then they probably thought it wasn't dangerous, but unfortunately for Goyen, almost when they popped down below the clouds to assess their position, they realised it was too late, pulled up, but by that time they'd already crashed into Eagles Rock.
As with so many famous incidents, some people have inevitably looked for sensational reasons for the Duke's death. But Garth feels that the conspiracy theories don't stand up to scrutiny.
In my opinion, there's way too much fantasy surrounding this crash. If the British really wanted the Duke of Kent assassinated in a plane crash, it would have been on bomb on board over the North Sea or something like that. Why would you risk an accident on a mountainside where people could survive, which they did, and where there's plenty of witnesses that could see what actually happened? No, not for me.
It's Garth's view that the Duke and the others who died with him were just the victims of a tragic accident. With that said, he concedes that some aspects of the crash don't have a complete explanation.
What was in the Duke's briefcase and why did he have it? Was there Swedish money in there? What was that for? Who was actually flying the plane? Was Goyen flying the plane and his boss Mosley then took over? Perhaps he didn't like what he was doing or how he was doing it? Who knows? We'll perhaps never know. Even if the crash was an accident, I'm open to the fact that the Duke may have been on some sort of covert or secret mission. It's one mystery that will never be explained.